Hello, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. We have a packed agenda today, so it's 12:01. We will start right away. Thank you for joining our Lunch and Learn September edition. My name is Maja, your senior HR consultant with H2R, and your host for today. Just a few housekeeping items. As you can see, you have been muted. So if you have any questions, please use our chat or the Q&A box. And you may ask questions at any time, and we'll be happy to answer those. I am happy to share that we will be having quarterly legal updates with Evan Campbell, and he's joining us today to speak about some key legal developments. And Jackie's back this month with her topic on coaching. And her and I share the same belief that coaching is no longer just a nice to have, but it is a must have for leaders in today's workforce. So here we are, ready to start. Evan, over to you.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. Great to be back this month providing a bit of a legal update. And the plan today is for me to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and I'm going to spend a bit of time just reviewing some recent legislative changes just to make sure we're all mindful of what's changing and what may be coming down the pipes in terms of changes. And then I'm going to touch on some cases from the last few months, some great cases for employers, and of course, some cautionary tales that hopefully we can pull some learning from about things that we should do and not do. So let's dive into it and start with reviewing some of the recent legislative changes. So firstly, just want to flag for everyone that Ontario's minimum wage is increasing to $17.20 as of October 1st. Just something to be mindful of if you have any employees in that bandwidth. And also something to be mindful of if you have employees who are above that, but creeping up or getting close to them in ways, they're going to be pushing back in terms of wage increases. So let's move on and talk a bit about the Working for Workers For Act. And this is something we touched a bit on in our last discussion. I want to flag a few of the important developments that I think will impact potentially your organizations. So this was legislation that was passed on March 21st of this year, but it had different timeframes in terms of when certain changes will come into effect. And these are changes to the Ontario Employment Standards Act. So we have a handful of changes which came into place June 21st of 2024. And then we have a handful of things that have yet to come into force, but things that I thought be helpful for all of you to be aware of. So let's start off by talking about the changes that are already in force. And hopefully these are things that you're aware of and are already addressing. But firstly, in terms of the payment of wages, this is one of those obvious things, but one thing I want to make sure we all touch on, which is this amendment to the Employment Standards Act specified that the account that we're paying the employee via direct deposit must be an account that, of course, the employee has specifically chosen, must be in the individual's name, must only be accessible by that specific employee. So one of those things where I think we're all like, of course, that all makes sense, but it's something that when you're doing onboarding as part of your organization, you're going to want to make sure that you're confirming those very specific details to ensure compliance. The second piece is in relation to the payment of vacation pay. And so as many of you know, the standard way that we pay vacation pay is as a lump sum prior to the individual taking their vacation time. That's generally how vacation pay is paid. And this amendment by the Working for Workers For Act requires that if we as the employer want to pay vacation pay in a different way, that we need the employee to agree in writing. And so probably the most common or obvious example would be where we want to pay an employee their vacation pay on each pay period. So for example, you've got an hourly employee, or this is very common with part-time employees, where they're not necessarily taking their vacation time. And so we just simply every pay period pay out the required percentage of vacation pay. But again, if that's something we want to do, nothing wrong with that. We just need to make sure that we have the appropriate sign off with the individual. Or other organizations that I work with have specified timeframes within either the vacation year or the calendar year when that accrued vacation pay is paid out. So not necessarily tied to the timing of the vacation. So again, one of those things, nothing wrong with that as a process. We just have to make sure that the employee signs off. So important to, again, review your internal processes. If you have those different types of arrangements, we just need to make sure that we are getting employee sign off and agreement, and that we're building that type of sign off into the onboarding process, either through a contract or through some type of other document. And I'll just pause here. I should have said this at the outset, but happy to take questions throughout the presentation. So any questions, anytime. We have the Q&A box, which we can, of course, monitor and jump in.
Evan, there is a question
Awesome.
from Joanna. For the payment of wages and ensuring it's only accessible by the employee, does this mean they cannot deposit into a joint account?
No, because it's also people that they have authorized essentially to access those funds. So joint accounts, as long as the individual has agreed essentially, then there's nothing prohibiting that type of arrangement. Obviously very common, right? So no issue in terms of those type of scenarios. A good question. So in terms of vacation pay, that's the key thing I would suggest you take away, which is just review your processes. If you have any, deviations in terms of how vacation pay is paid, just make sure we're documenting that through an agreement. Of course, retain those agreements is all important back-end processes. In terms of tips, so to the extent any of you have businesses where employees are getting tips, this will be important for you to flag. And to the extent we have a tip sharing arrangement, and again, this is where usually there's some pooling of tips and then some distribution among the employee group. Now we need to post a copy of the tip sharing policy in the workplace and then retain that policy for at least 3 years once the policy ceases to be in effect. So again, if you have this type of arrangement, really more of a process perspective, because hopefully if you are engaging in tip sharing, that's properly documented, but if not, of course, needs to be. And this is just a process that you need to post this. That way it's coming to the attention of the employee group. So those are things that are in place now. Let's talk about a few things that aren't enforced yet, but things we want to keep our eye on. Firstly, job posting requirements. And this was talked a fair amount in our last session, so I won't spend a lot of time on it today. But again, one thing you're definitely going to want to keep your eye on to the extent you're doing any internal recruitment. And of course, if you're engaging H2R on that, they'll for sure ensure that their processes are in compliance. One thing I wanted to touch on that I thought was quite interesting is in relation to the AI disclosure requirement. And again, this is part of the recruitment process. And so one provision, which isn't enforced yet, but I think will likely come into play at some point, requires that the use of AI be disclosed as part of that recruitment process. And this is interesting, I think, because really it was driven by the Human Rights Commission and concerns that it had raised as to the potential bias that can arise through the use of AI, which is interesting because I think a lot of people view the use of technology and AI as a potential mechanism to take out the bias that all of us potentially bring forth to the table. But again, this is one flag that kind of caught my attention and a good reminder that even through the use of technology, we have to turn our minds to, well, what is the potential consequence that we aren't seeing that can arise through the use of this tool, and can it potentially weed out candidates in a discriminatory fashion? So again, I think we all are evolving to the use of AI, and law is the same. Law is grappling with this notion of AI and how it's used, and I think we'll see developments probably quickly over the next months and years in terms of cases that flow out of the use of AI. But something, again, I would just flag for us to be aware of if to the extent any of you are using it both internally or even through the recruitment process. So that is some very quick and high level legislative developments I want everyone to be aware of. Let's switch gears and talk a bit about this, then we'll get into some cases. So firstly, on the Working for Workers 5 Act, just wanted to flag the increased fines for offenders. Of course, hopefully none of you are in that bucket, but to the extent you have any ESA compliance issues, we're starting to see the increase of penalties and fines that flow from that. And one other flag that I wanted to remind everyone in that as of Jan 1 this year, the Employment Standards Act prohibits an organization from knowingly using an unlicensed temporary help agency or recruiter. And there's actually a website that organizations can go on and check to see if their recruiter is licensed or if the temporary help agency they're getting their temporary workers from is properly licensed. So again, just flagging that for all of us who potentially use those type of services. If you're engaging a third party, just make sure that they've gone through the steps and have been properly registered and licensed through the government. Now let's get into the cases. So wanted to flag a number of cases. So these are all cases from 2024, last few years. And I'm going to start off by touching on a few cases from the Human Rights Tribunal, which are actually really positive developments for us as employers. And then I'm going to touch on a few cases which are cautionary tales, things to remember, and hopefully some good lessons for us. So let's start off with this Good Life Fitness decision. And this is your classic scenario, which I think many of us have come across, where a former employee raises a harassment complaint. And often the question that I would get is, hey, Evan, like, what do we do? We got this employee, maybe they resigned, maybe we terminated them. And months after the employment relationship ended, they bring forth some type of complaint against some other employee. Do we have to investigate? What's our obligations in that type of scenario? And so this decision from the Human Rights Tribunal directly addressed that specific issue. And the basic facts were that the employee reported the harassment complaint 6 months after their termination. And so the employer in that scenario argued that it was not obligated to investigate the complaint, in part because the individual is no longer an employee, and also a part due to the delay, the fact that it was 6 months following the alleged incidents. And ultimately, the Human Rights Tribunal agreed with the employer and dismissed the case. And the reasoning was that, generally failing to investigate harassment complaints is a violation of workplace discrimination requirements and laws. But this does not apply, again, from the tribunal's perspective, once the individual is no longer an employee. So again, a good outcome for us. It gives us a little confidence in those scenarios to say, look, we don't necessarily have a legal obligation to investigate, but I would just throw a little bit of caution here. I think there's lots of scenarios that arise where, whether an individual is an employee or not, where we may not have a strict legal obligation, but there still may be a lot of good reasons why we want to look into that scenario and want to do an investigation. And for example, obvious example comes to my mind where we have an individual who's no longer an employee and has advanced a complaint maybe against a leader in the organization. And that individual is a manager of various individuals. And depending on the nature of the complaint, we probably want to know if it's valid or not, because that could expose us to other liability if this individual is engaging in a course of conduct in relation to various individuals, right? So it's better to get ahead of it, do the investigation, find out if there's any validity, than potentially, brushing it aside. So again, some good jurisprudence there, but we want to, I think, take a practical and pragmatic approach to some of these issues as they arise. The second case from the Human Rights Tribunal, which provides us some good case law from the employer's perspective, is this Family Options Incorporated case. And this case, the employer was a provider of residential housing and support services for adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And there was a various staffing schedules because these individuals often needed 24-hour care. And so the individual at issue in this case requested accommodation on the basis of family status. And she was essentially a single parent, had a 6-year-old child, and had requested essentially different shifts that she couldn't work past a certain time as a result of the family status considerations. And so the employer in this case did the right thing. They engaged with this individual on a good faith basis. They tried to offer various alternative shifts that could potentially accommodate this individual's obligations, family status obligations. For example, they offered 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. shifts on weekends. They offered different proposals. And ultimately, the employee at issue pushed back and said, nope, I'm not agreeing to any of that. I'm only agreeing to what I want, my specific request. And ultimately, the tribunal found that there was no discrimination. It accepted the employer's position that essentially what the applicant wanted didn't exist. Like, it wasn't a shift that existed, and it also wasn't operationally feasible to be created for this specific scenario. And ultimately, the tribunal said, as we all know, but this is a good reminder, is that the individual is entitled to their accommodation, of course, but it has to be reasonable, not perfect, right? That person is not entitled to, I want this exact thing and I'm only taking this exact thing. That's not the kind of legal test. The test is, well, is what the employer is putting forth reasonable? Is it a reasonable option? Does it address the accommodation needs? And really, is it kind of feasible based on the overall circumstances? So the real takeaway from this case is a good reminder for all of us in that employees are, of course, entitled to accommodation, and we need to do our absolute best to accommodate their specific needs. But that doesn't mean they're entitled to the absolute perfect. And it doesn't mean necessarily that they're entitled to what exactly they want in that specific scenario, but rather the real threshold is reasonable. Is what the employer is putting forth reasonable? And if it is, then we're going to discharge our duty to accommodate within that specific scenario. And family status is, I often find, a really challenging accommodation framework, right? Because we're dealing with people's lives, and it's not like often where we have potentially a medical accommodation where we can go to the doctor and say to us, give us the restrictions, let's engage in this analysis. So it can be a little more challenging. And I think employers are often a little hesitant in those scenarios to say, nope, we're not doing this. Here's our option, and here's our offer to you. And so, again, I think this gives us a little more confidence to maybe take a firm stance in some of these requests. Not to say that the answer is no, we're not accommodating, but really the answer is, hey, we've done a really robust assessment. We've considered your needs. We consider the organization, and here's what we have. Here's what we think is going to work. And then as long as we go through an appropriate process, we are going to meet our obligations. So some good cases from the human rights perspective. Now let's switch gears and talk.
There's just a question that came in from Margarita in regards to your previous slide on recruitment. What is the website where an employer can check if their recruiter or recruitment firm is licensed?
Good question. And maybe as me trying to read that off, how about we circulate that at some point as part of the slides? I'll plug it in the slides before they're circulated around, and then people can simply click on that. Happy to provide that, track it down. Let's talk about some, so let's talk about some of these cases that give us a bit. Oh, Sue posted a link, which is great. Thanks, Sue. So let's talk a bit about these two cases, which are a bit of a cautionary tale, I think, for us as employers. And so firstly, the Boyer decision. And this case dealt with an individual who announced their intention to retire. And they said, look, I'm going to retire at the end of 2016. Halfway through the year, there was obviously a bit of a disagreement among this individual and the employer, and the employee advances a claim and says that they were constructively dismissed and they were essentially forced to retire early in the middle of 2016. Now, ultimately, the employer was successful in proving that the individual voluntarily resigned. So the whole constructive dismissal issue went away. But, there's a big but, the court ultimately found that the employee was entitled to about $1.8 million in damages for unpaid vacation pay and compensation owing to as a result of various compensation plans. And so really the rubber hit the road for the employer in terms of the policies and the compensation plans. And so in terms of this vacation pay issue, essentially the employee argued that they were entitled to 4 weeks of vacation. They never took it because they were always so busy, or they didn't take all of it. And therefore they were entitled to essentially some historic payment of vacation pay. And the employer said, hey, we got a use it or lose it policy. That person didn't use all of it. They can't carry it forward. They essentially get nothing. And unfortunately for the employer, the court basically found, well, great that that was the employer's perspective, but there was no policy. There was nothing in writing which laid out that term. And there was nothing to signal that the employee had agreed to that type of restriction. So essentially there was some money, not a lot, but some money found owing to that individual for this kind of vacation pay issue. The big piece of that $1.8 million was in relation to various deferred compensation. So we're talking stock options, bonus payments, that type of compensation structure. And all of those plans had specific terms which limited this individual's entitlement once the employment relationship ended. So all things that I'm sure we've all seen and all talked about, the importance of having restrictions on potential payouts once the employment relationship ended. So the policies themselves were fine, the plan was fine, but what the court said is there was zero evidence that this individual had actually ever agreed to those restrictions. So a real reminder for us, and this is where, I think as organizations, the back end admin work, which we don't often think about, really becomes important in this type of litigation because, again, there was no vacation policy, issue that easily could have been addressed. And then they probably paid some lawyer to draft these fancy plans, but then there was no actual implementation of the plans, right? There was no going to the employees, getting sign off, sticking those somewhere in some electronic file so when litigation starts, easily accessible. So all those things that we often don't think about but become really important when we're all in front of a judge and the judge goes, oh, hey, where does it show that this person signed off and agreed to that type of restriction? So it's a good reminder that I think we should all be mindful of. The other decision which I wanted to talk about from a cautionary tale perspective, a little bit of a wonky case, the Cekrlija versus Walkie decision, in that we had an employee 40 years plus and had entered discussions with the employer, who was a small business farm operation, around the need to have some assurances in terms of retirement and retirement planning. And this employer said, don't worry, you're going to get, I think it was 10% of the non-voting shares of one of the businesses which this employer owned. Fast forward a number of years, there's layoffs, there's concerns back and forth around this individual working, and ultimately the employee brings a claim asserting constructive dismissal. And ultimately the employer found, yep, constructively dismissed, which again to me is not the lesson to be learned from this case, because what the court said is, okay, not only do you get your 24 months of pay because you've been constructively dismissed, but oh yeah, the employer made that promise 2 years ago, you're going to get that as well. And I think that was like $150,000 was the monetary value attributed to that kind of promise. So again, a real kind of reminder to all of us in that be careful what you say to the employees, right? Especially if you're an owner operator of a business and it's maybe easy to say things in the moment to appease individuals, but those can have legal consequences down the road. So got to be really careful about the promises we make to the employees, because those will most definitely or potentially be enforced. Let's go to the next slide. I want to touch on one more decision. It cannot be a case law update without a termination clause case nowadays. So last case, and many of you may have heard of this case, which is the default incorporation of the Township of Ignis decision, which dealt with the enforceability of a termination provision in an employment contract. And ultimately, the termination clause read along the lines, as you see on the screen, that the township may, at its sole discretion and without cause, terminate at any time upon giving the employee, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, the court found that the use of the word sole discretion and at any time made this provision unenforceable for contravention of the Employment Standards Act. And the logic being that obviously there's some limitations on when employers can terminate employees under the Employment Standards Act. We can't fire someone on a maternity leave, for example, or other job protected leave. So the court said, hey, by use of the kind of any time or sole discretion, that has the potential to contravene the Employment Standards Act. So the lesson I would suggest from this is, as we all know, courts hate termination language in employment contracts, and they're subject to significant scrutiny. And this decision is ultimately being appealed. I know in speaking with the lawyer on this file, and hopefully, I think it was heard recently. So hopefully the logic is overturned, because I don't think it's particularly sound. But as of now, we're stuck with this decision. And so what I'm suggesting to all of the organizations I work with is, hey, every 12 months, we should be taking a look at those contracts, tweaking them, because even one or two minor words can make a massive difference in terms of enforceability. And I often get clients and organizations saying to me, like, hey, Evan, why do we even bother? Like, what's the point? Every single decision that comes from the courts finds that termination clauses in employment contracts are not enforceable for some wonky reason. Like, why are we going through the effort? And I am of the view that, hey, termination clauses are still great. We need employment contracts. Let's make them the absolute best. There will be cases eventually where employers win on these. But even if we don't, at the very least, it gives us leverage in the negotiations that can happen following a dismissal of an employee. So if from a very practical level, when you terminate an employee and that employee goes to a lawyer, and the lawyer sends you a letter saying you're the worst organization ever, and we respond and we get involved, and depending on our position on that, if there's any negotiation, having any leverage point can be helpful, obviously, because we can say to them, hey, we think this in contract's enforceable. We think the employee is entitled to nothing, and therefore their request for X is completely out to lunch, but we'll pay this much minor amount. And by having some risk on their side that the person gets nothing, it gives us the chance of getting some leverage there. So that's, again, just a reminder. I think it's important just to touch those up and make sure that you're connecting with your HR team to make sure they're up to date. I know there was one question I see in the chat.
There's actually two. So
okay.
What if you try to implement a policy and get employees sign an acknowledgement, but they simply don't, even after many follow-ups and reminders? Is it ever enough to show proof that the information was communicated to the employee, for example, via a company email?
Yeah, great question. I think this happens, right? And maybe it's the employee willfully saying, no, I don't want to agree to this, or it's just like, I don't want to be bothered, so I'm just going to ignore. And I would say the classic legal answer, it depends what we're trying to restrict. So I think vacation policies, all that stuff, perfect world, we want everything signed off, of course. But our employee handbook, our vacation policies, if we can't get employees to sign off, demonstrating a communication, demonstrating that they're essentially consenting through action, all of that's helpful. But when we're talking about plans that restrict termination entitlements, either in terms of like termination clauses or restrict entitlement to compensation post-termination, then we 100% need that signed off. And so I think the very forceful way to get sign off is, of course, when you're rolling out your compensation plans, and for example, you're putting forth stock options or nice discretionary bonuses. Essentially, the employee is not eligible unless they sign off, right? And ideally want to build in some specific language in terms of them getting the ability to get legal advice on those documents and building in timeframes that they can. So if we're really, that's kind of the lens I would look at it. If we are significantly limiting someone's entitlement, like in that one case where we're talking essentially $1 million, well, 100% we've got to make sure that the employee has put the either the electronic ink or the real ink to the paper to demonstrate sign off.
Great. Okay, another question that came in from Tanya. For vacation policy, it is enough to say in the employment contract that the vacation pay in the amount of 4%, or whichever it is, will be provided on the biweekly paycheck, or does there need to be a separate policy that is more detailed, i.e. 2 weeks unpaid in a calendar year?
So I think I was looking at the question. So if we're solely focused on compliance with the changes to the Employment Standards Act around the timing of the vacation pay, so that needs to be in writing and we need to get them to sign off. A contract provision which specifically outlines that should be sufficient to comply with that requirement. But I think just to expand on this question, we all know that there's more requirements when it comes to vacation under the Employment Standards Act. So we have vacation time, we have vacation pay, and oftentimes the policies lay out other things beyond simply when they'll get the vacation pay. So I think my view would be, depending on when you're paying vacation pay, we got to make sure sign off, and that can be through a contract. But we also want to have that policy, which hopefully addresses a whole bunch of stuff when it comes to vacation generally, like booking vacation time, making sure people are taking their vacation time to ensure compliance, all those things. So address kind of those other issues beyond simply when they're going to get the actual payment.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers the question.
A follow-up question from Tanya. If the employment contract states, subject only to providing you with the minimum entitlements pursuant to the ESA, the company may terminate your employment at any time without notice or pay in lieu of notice if you engage in willful misconduct, disobedience, or willful neglect of duty that is not trivial and has not been condoned by the company. Is that enough, or does the language around any time need to change?
So I would say broad strokes, when we look at termination clauses in employment contracts, we need to look at the entire contract. So that's my legal caveat, because the way courts look at those employment contracts is they look at the entire contract and they say, is anything in this contract which touches on termination in contravention of the Employment Standards Act? If the answer is yes, then we're in trouble. So my only caveat, Tanya, is be careful about focusing on this one provision. We need to look at the entire contract. This one provision which talks about termination essentially for willful misconduct being the just cause standard under the Employment Standards Act, I would say out of the abundance of caution, tweaking and removing at any time is likely a good step just to address that issue, right? And really it's, do I think this is enforceable? I think we have a shot, but let's try to remove any potential argument from plaintiff side counsel. And this is where these little tweaks every year is going to be important. But again, just make sure we look at everything, because this one provision may be okay. But if, for example, I've seen in contracts, we'll talk about under a confidentiality clause, for example, which we'll talk about, if you breach this, we can fire you. Well, that, even though it's not in the termination section, talks about termination. And if that's void, then the entire termination clause is void. So just a good reminder, look at everything. So I've been rambling on for a long time. Let me do a couple of takeaways and I'll pass it off to Jackie because I know she'll have some great things to say. Again, just some very high level reminders, legislative updates, employment contracts are fantastic. We just got to make sure we use them properly, and just good old HR 101 policies, document, and then retain everything. So thanks a lot for everyone attending and listening, and I'll pass it back and pass it off to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Evan. And again, if there are other questions for Evan, feel free to send those over and we'll take them up. Over to Jackie.
Hello, everybody. Hello. I apologize up front because I'm quite sick. I don't even hear my own voice. There's so much crap in my head. I also understand that many of you are also sick, so I guess this virus is going around. I want to take a little bit of time to talk to you about my belief that leading by coaching and using your coaching hat and your coaching skills is really critical now. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. And so let me just back that up with some of my slides. So let's dig in. So let's make sure we're aligned on what is coaching, like because I'm noticing quite a number of people assume mentoring is coaching. So let's make sure we're kind of looking at it through the same lens and the same language, right? It's a collaborative process between the person coaching, which could be a boss or someone internal or external, and the individual being coached. Its intention, right? Its aim is to enhance performance, enhance personal growth, and help the employee or the person being coached to achieve their goals faster. I always say, you're going to get there anyway. I just want to get you there faster, or I want to get you somewhere else that's going to have you more fulfilled, right? It's about setting objectives, developing strategies, giving feedback. There's nothing better to me, in my opinion, when I get that kind of fostering, that sort of self-awareness in myself and the person being coached. That collaboration is beautiful. And then I've put in the ICF definition as well, right? It's that process of coaching that really should unlock someone's potential. And isn't that great leadership? You know, when we have really great leaders, that should definitely be a part of their role. And I'll obviously keep bringing that up. All right. So next slide. What is coaching not? Let's just, again, just make sure that we're singing off the same song sheet. It's not therapy, right? You know, coaching is focused on goal setting and future growth, but the therapist is looking at what's happened in your past and what might there need to be an explanation of something that's happening in your present from your past. So it's about the healing. A coach's job is not to diagnose or treat mental health conditions unless you're qualified to do so. Mentoring, right, involves giving, you know, your experience, providing some guidance based on where you've been to someone who's got less experience. Coaching is more about facilitating the client's own insights and solutions. Consulting, right? I'm an expert, giving advice, solving problems. Don't get me wrong, we also put our coach hat on too, because when we are coaching, the person we're coaching is discovering their own answers, their own strategies, their own thought process, assumptions, biases. It's not training, right? That's about delivering something where you're an expert. It's not advising, same as consulting. It's not performance management. That's the one that drives me nuts the most. Coaching is not about evaluating or judging. It's about a supportive process aimed at enhancing capabilities. Do we give feedback? Sure. And then we coach through it. That's where we're wearing multiple hats. Like I have feedback from my perspective. So that's a whole discussion we could have. These are multiple hats that we're wearing. I just want to make sure we're aligned on what coaching means. And it's certainly not a one-time fix, right? I've had two of those in the past 2 weeks where it's like, you know, Jackie, we got this guy. And it's like, so you're thinking I can solve this in one conversation? It's generally a process that's going to unfold over time as you're building the trust and the collaboration between the person or persons being coached with their coach. So let's make sure that we're clear in understanding those distinctions. So there's clarity around the role or the hat that you're using in that moment with your employee. All right, next slide. So let's make sure. I wanted to share with you, I guess, my belief systems, and please put stuff in the chat because you all hold wisdom and knowledge that's important to share with each other. And side note, Maya, I noticed when you were reading the questions, was that in the Q&A box?
Yes, it was.
Okay, because I can't read that, but I can see the chat. So I just wanted to make sure.
Gotcha.
I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing something wrong. All right. So the evolution of coaching in business has changed. I put my coach hat on in June 2000. So it was 24 years ago. And man, like I was part of the ICF board at the time when we were starting out. I'm that old. Thank you very much. But it's really evolved, especially in the last decade, and even more so, in my opinion, since the pandemic, because we've learned how important the skill set of coaching is from a leadership and organizational perspective. So we've moved from niche to mainstream, right? Coaching is more mainstream than it ever was before. There's a definite focus on leadership development. So orgs are increasingly investing in executive coaching, which is great to see, specifically and intentionally developing the leadership skills. So that focus has expanded to include coaching as well, teaching them how to coach, including middle management and high potential employees. Integration with talent management. So coaching is now often integrated into the broader talent strategies, which is great to see, including succession planning and performance reviews, employee engagement. Hoping I don't lose my voice. Shift towards the personalized approaches. So there's been a move from one size fits all training to getting more personalized one-on-one or team specific coaching. Use of tech, obviously, more digital tools and platforms that have helped in the way that we deliver the coaching. More and more virtual sessions. I'm old school. I still go phone, and there's lots of reasons for that. That's a whole other conversation. Depending on the need of my client, of course, I'll adjust accordingly for them. Emphasis on the soft skills and the EQ, EI space, which is great to see. To me, you're going to learn how to coach. You're definitely going to increase your emotional intelligence, right? The cultural transformation. So coaching is absolutely being used as a tool to foster a culture of continuous learning or feedback culture. I just did a program for 3 years with one client, specifically around transforming the culture, and then the pillars that we use to do that. Coaching was by far the one that the CEO loved the most. The focus on diversity and inclusion. So coaching initiatives are increasingly addressing the DEI space and helping orgs to create that inclusive environment by the way that people engage and listen to each other, stand in empathy, and all those, the things that coaching skills can add value around. Wellness and resiliency. Just had 2 conversations this morning with new clients saying, we got to do more to help our people. The recognition that mental health and well-being in the workplace, right, has definitely led coaching to focus on that sort of resilience, work-life balance, avoiding the burnout. I know us in HR, we've definitely been feeling it. And then, of course, coaching, lots of collaboration within HR. Some of the greatest coaches are you folks anyway, because you've been doing it for a long time. So that to me is just, it's like sharing my context around what I believe is the evolution of coaching in the workplace. Again, if there's something you disagree with or you want to add, please share with each other in the chat. You're most welcome. All right, next slide. So, and again, I'm not going to spend too much time here because this one's kind of obvious. These are traditional leadership styles, and there's a place for them. Like autocratic leadership is when you decide unilaterally with little input from people. You don't need to put your coach hat on. And there are moments where that's important, but being able to round out with a skill set that allows you to look for input and pull together people's perspectives or manage their annoyance or disagreement. The laissez-faire, hands-off approach, transactional, it can motivate in the short term, but it doesn't inspire long-term commitment or innovation because it's so transactional. It takes a lot of, it will often overlook personal growth and intrinsic motivation. Bureaucratic leadership, heavy on the rules, charismatic. I got one right now. God, he's good. He's the CEO of a big global company, this guy, Mr. Charisma. Everybody loves the guy. However, there's an over-reliance on his charm. And so what we're noticing is the company got really big. They're missing some of the systems and processes and have become codependent on him instead of building out the leadership bench for everybody. That's not a good thing when that happens. Directive leadership. So just to me, it's just my way of saying, in contrast, coaching as a leadership approach emphasizes collaboration and empowerment and continuous development. It fosters the environment that we need today in our workplaces, where people feel valued and engaged and a safe place to be themselves and to bring new ideas to the table. So for me, it was just my way of saying, again, that these can work in the right place, but if we're not also including the coaching skill set to allow us to collaborate and create those safe places, we're going to have a problem. All right. I'm selling this old, I'm sure. In this case, I just wanted to share with you what's happening in the workforce. You guys are all experts in this. Just read the list for a moment. More collaboration. There's desire for that flexibility, even if you just look at things like remote work. Absolute focus on mental health and well-being. There's lots more organizations I'm noticing allowing creating spaces for people to know their own personal value systems, as well as the purpose and values of the org, and making sure there's alignment there. Lots of L&D going on, especially in the virtual world, but it's going back to in-person in some cases. And it's a way of engaging people so that they feel like there's growth and opportunity, even if the role is still the same. Feedback culture is a big one for me. I'm really noticing organizations wanting to bring in things like courageous conversation to have really great feedback. A lot of data-driven decision-making in HR happening in the last decade is great. Innovation and agility, love seeing that. You know, we got Disrupt HR coming up soon, so I hope I get to see you all there. We want our employees to feel empowered. Most of us do. That is for darn sure. So next slide. So what's the coaching mindset? For me, it's just make sure that we're like, what do we need to do to help the leaders understand what's the mindset? It is around collaboration. It is around standing in empathy and growth. I had one new client say to me yesterday, Jackie, this coaching thing, man, like, just takes time. And I said, okay, let's play this out, right? So the excuse is, I don't have time to slow down for those kind of one-on-one conversations. And I said, then what's the impact? And he got there. I didn't need to feed him the answers. In the end, he's like, I know, you're right. Then I start doing it myself. And then I've got a bunch of people who are codependent, and then they resent me and I resent them. And I'm like, you got it, right? The mindset is involving your team members or individuals, seeing their unique strengths, understanding and valuing their potential, and then prioritizing those development goals. All right, let's dig in a little bit more around coaching mindset. I've just did a bit more detail here, so I know we'll make sure you guys get the slides. So for me, I'll just zip through it, but I wanted to make sure you had some depth in case it was useful to you inside your organization. So the coaching mindset for leaders is a way of sort of thinking and approaching leadership that emphasizes the collaboration, the empathy, the active listening, all of those things. It's a way of being, in my opinion. I often say I don't think coaching is specifically a role, but it's a skill we all need to have, right? So part of it is empathy and active listening. Let's make sure we're understanding each other, encouraging expression, creating safe places for open dialogue, allowing employees to share concerns, let them push back, allow them to share their aspirations and their hopes. Let's have curiosity and growth orientation. Are we creating lifelong learning moments in our organizations? We want leaders to embrace that mindset of continuous improvement for themselves and for those that they're leading. And of course, growth and curiosity includes asking great questions, focusing on those open-ended questions for which you have no answer, because I don't want you to be manipulative. Empowerment and autonomy, so delegating responsibility. A coaching leader empowers their people to take ownership. They encourage initiative, so they support that taking of initiative and exploring new ideas. I always say, if you don't have time for that, let them know. This time, I'm telling you, next time I'll be open. Like, it's like there's always, you want to make sure that you are really clear about why you're choosing what mindset or what way of leading in that moment. It also requires constructive feedback, being really good at providing ongoing, specific, actionable feedback that focuses on growth rather than criticism. And then make sure we're celebrating successes and recognizing, achievements and progress, whether it's individually or as a team or even in relationship with each other. Goal setting and accountability, collaborative goal setting. Hello, I've got a whole sales team out in Southern California, and they're so mad at their chief revenue officer because their goals were set for them for their first time in 10, 15 years. And they don't buy into the numbers. And what's going to happen? They're going to start to engage. They'll probably start to leave the job, and they won't hit anywhere near their number. So it's really important to have that collaborative goal setting. And then, of course, learn to hold people accountable. Support team members by taking accountability in their progress and the way that you even show up as a leader. Let's build trust in relationships, make sure they're authentic. Coaching mindset, is about finding that beautiful space that fosters safety, right? I always say I want them to feel safe enough to open their kimono, not legit, but just as a metaphor, to really feel vulnerable and that they're safe in that vulnerability and showing that it's okay to make mistakes. Focusing on strengths, right? Strength-based approach. Leaders with that coaching mindset identify and leverage strengths for team members. And there's a focus on personalized development. So tailoring the coaching and the questions and the conversations to fit that individual's aspirations and strengths, as well as the organizational goals and the job requirements. And then the last one just included resilience and adaptability, the coaching mindset, encouraging resiliency. So leaders with a coaching mindset will help team members develop that resiliency when they're facing challenges. I had someone, I think it was Thursday last week, and it was just like, I get this is hard right now and stressful. And I said, are you ready to explore how you've shown that resiliency in the past and tell me a story? And she said, okay. She wasn't sure at first. And it was fun watching her on video tell the story of where she had a difficult moment. And you could see her shoulders going back and her head lifting up. And it's like, now coach yourself from this space where you know you can handle this. It just shifts people. So that kind of mindset, around that adaptability and resilience is modeling it for your people and helping them to find it for themselves. All right, I better press on, wrap this up in a couple minutes here. So why is coaching essential in today's workforce? I've kind of covered this in all of those different categories. So let's move on to the next slide. Sorry, Eleni. Apologies. So I just wanted to throw out some ideas for you. If you haven't already, and I know I see some of your names on the screen, I know a number of you have instituted coaching. I've got some clients that have coaching pods and peer coaching pods or teams for each other. So I went in and did some training on how to be a great coach, and then they took it away and turned it into their own thing. I think that's amazing. What a great culture they're creating by doing that. So make sure there's leadership commitment. You got to model. I mean, if there's not, it's it's going to die on the vine. Leaders should exemplify those coaching behaviors and really communicate clearly the vision. Make sure, starting to lose my voice. Put the training and development in place, provide the training for them, ongoing learning opportunities, create that safe environment, ensuring like modeling and demonstrating the open communication and normalizing feedback, giving and receiving. Empower your people, right? So encourage the autonomy, allow team members to take ownership of their projects and decisions, support their individual goals, help them set those goals, and provide resources and support if you're able, or at least help them to figure out what those could be for themselves. Make sure we're celebrating successes and recognizing achievements and creating a safe place to share stories, to highlight, coaching success with each other. Integrating coaching, I'm getting some water, forgive me. Integrating coaching into performance management. I can hear my voice 1 minute. Leverage the tech where we can. So implement some of the tools and platforms that will allow coaching conversations. There's a place where it's the right time for in-person, the right time for video. And there's also the right moment for a quick Slack chat. Like it's like, hey, coach, or boss, whatever the case may be. It's like creating the norms and the rituals around doing and leveraging the tech for the right kind of coaching. And then making sure that we're creating a place that fosters the peer coaching, whether it's through pods or something they choose to set up on their own. And absolutely make sure that we're evaluating, adjusting, assess the coaching culture. Let's regularly evaluate. Is it effective? Are leaders doing it consistently with your vision and the mission that you have for a coaching culture? And being open to change, using that feedback to continually refine how we're asking our leaders to show up for the folks inside our organization. All right, Eleni. All right, last slide on measuring. And go to the next slide for me, because you guys are smart and you can read this. So just a quick moment of Q&A. Does anyone have any questions for me? I'm selling the soul, I'm sure.
I don't see any questions coming in, but Jackie, thank you so much. I know you're not feeling well, and thank you for talking to us more about the coaching and what it really means in the workplace. Now, if someone's interested in finding out more about what coaching packages are available, Jackie, is there something that you can provide, or should they just reach out to us?
Yeah, we can sit down with anyone and just brainstorm what's possible. There's lots of different options, whether it's individual or team. There's lots of ways of designing it that fits the budget,
Excellent. And I know at H2R, we're working behind the scenes with Jackie and some of our other coaches in the community to bring some exciting packages. So stay tuned for that. All right. So I am just going to briefly cover our HR updates. Next slide. So I just wanted to do from our H2R Learning Academy, I actually wanted to highlight this course really quickly, Difficult Conversations, a guide for leaders. We actually partnered with Jackie in developing and creating this online course, and it was designed to really explore why difficult conversations are essential, the benefits of having a tough conversation, and then how different personalities impact the entire conversation process. So if you haven't had training on this topic, I urge you to reach out to us. It's approximately 45 minutes in length and it costs $60 per person. And I really believe this is one of those courses that should be essential for any emerging or new leader in their, in their role. So reach out to us for more. And then quickly on our HR services, I wanted to mention that we've expanded our service offering in the area of accounting. We're happy to provide bookkeeping, accounting, and interim controller services in addition to our payroll services to new or existing clients. So reach out if you're interested in learning more and our pricing. And just to wrap it up, we are going to spin the wheel. We are giving away a free course, the one that I just mentioned on difficult conversations for leaders. So I'm just going to take control here quickly and spin the wheel. All right. And the winner is Jennifer Fuss. If you're here, please write your name in the chat or say hello. Aline, can you just let me know if she's present? I
Yeah.
can't see the chat.
I don't see, let's see the chat here. Oh, she is here.
Oh, excellent. All right. So we will reach out to you with more information and congratulations. All right. So that wraps up our Lunch and Learn for September. If there are any questions, please let us know. If not, we will be back next month. I believe it's October 24th, but stay tuned for the invitation and see you everyone next month. Thank you for joining and bye for now.